Kinney Safe House, undisclosed location, USA, July 22, 2012. The safe house that they had chosen to move Laura's family to after recovering them from the Weapon X facility had been selected for a number of reasons, not the least of which was due to its solitude. The two-story log cabin stood in a large clearing in the middle of an old-growth forest out in the middle of nowhere, miles away from even the most rudimentary of roads, and tens of miles away from their closest neighbor. Regardless of how large the cabin was, it hadn't been built to fit the number of people that had been living in it for the last 3 months, which had taken some adjustment for everyone involved. Laura's sisters had ended up having to pair up in the 2 bedrooms they had available on the ground floor, with Belladonna and Paris sharing one room, while Zelda and Gabrielle shared the other. This had left them with one last bedroom that shared the second floor with the home office that had been installed by the previous owner, along with a small 3/4 bathroom that helped supplement the full bathroom on the ground floor. Sarah Kinney had decided to set up a folding cot in the office she had been using while going through all of the information that they had recovered from the facility. This had left Natasha as the only person in the cabin to have an actual bedroom to herself, in spite of the argument she'd had with Sarah about the fact that she was only there with them around half the time, on account of all of the other missions she was still being sent out on. Natasha was currently grateful for the relative solitude that had been granted to her as she stood in front of her bedroom window with the lights off, staring blindly out at trunks of the trees that stood across the moonlit clearing that surrounded the house. The blank expression on her face revealed nothing of the turmoil she was feeling on the inside, as the footage that Sarah had found of the doctors surgically removing the claws of a younger Laura acted as a painful reminder of the operation that had been similarly done on Natasha herself all those years ago as part of her graduation ceremony, with the Red Room. She had only just returned from her most recent mission for S.H.I.E.L.D., and had been in the process of unpacking her duffel when she had heard Sarah crying out in shock through her still-open bedroom door. Expecting some kind of attack, Natasha had only just reached the short hallway the two of them shared at the top of the stairs when the distraught doctor burst out of her office, nearly knocking the gun out of Natasha's hand as she rushed past her and into the bathroom, just lifting the toilet seat just in time for it to catch the escaping contents of her stomach. Natasha had ended up sharing that same bathroom with Sarah, rubbing circles on her upper back and holding her hair when necessary, and helping her with a glass of water once her stomach had finally managed to settle down. It had taken nearly half an hour before she was finally able to get the distraught mother to tell her what had happened. That had led Natasha to the first of apparently several videos that the sadistic Dr. Rice had made of the process they had used to coat Laura's newly formed claws with adamantium, by first surgically removing them from her body without anesthetics, leaving the young girl strapped down on the examination table while they prepared them to be implanted back into her body, which had naturally required them to cut her back open to remove the new set of bone claws that had already regrown to replace them. She was glad that Sarah had already gone off to seek comfort with the rest of her children when she found another video showing that this entire process had been repeated several times over the last few years as Laura outgrew each subsequent set of claws as they failed to grow with her. The formula they were using to create the adamantium apparently lacked the specific impurities that had allowed it to change into the adamantium beta that the original Weapon X had bonded to his entire skeleton, which prevented them from repeating the same process on Laura herself until she was fully grown. The sadistic glee with which Dr. Rice had mentioned looking forward to repeating the process the hard way made Natasha glad that Laura has already killed him. While it wouldn't have had the same effect as Natasha's own surgical sterilization, Laura's own future graduation ceremony would have been just as lasting in its own way. Natasha stood there staring blindly out the window as she imagined Laura strapped down to that same examination bed as a group of doctors cut her open so that they could attach shining metal plates to her exposed bones. This waking nightmare soon evolved, until it was a young Natasha herself laying there strapped to a familiar examination table back in the Red Room, crying out to the doctors that she wasn't done growing yet. Natasha took a shuddering gasp of breath as the sound of someone gently knocking on her bedroom door snapped her mind back into focus. Quickly checking her makeup using the inside of the window, and smoothing her tactical suit down with her hands, she gave herself a moment to regain her composure before making her way across the small room. Sarah had her hand raised to knock again when Natasha opened the door, and there was an awkward pause before the doctor used her still raised hand to tuck some of her hair behind an ear. I wanted to thank you, Sarah said, nervously clearing her throat, for everything you've been doing to help keep me and my daughters safe. You don't need to, Natasha started to say. Yes, I do, Sarah interrupted, wrapping her arms over her stomach. Stunned by the vehemence with which the other woman had spoken, Natasha took an instinctive half-step back, slightly turning her body to block the view of her hand drifting down to the grip of the pistol strapped to her thigh. I know you watched the videos of the operation, Sarah continued, unaware of the dangerous moment that had just passed. We both know what would have happened to Laura, to all of my daughters, if you hadn't helped get us out of there. So, yes, I do need to thank you. Because of you, my daughters have been able to run around and play in the forest, and bug me to read them bedtime stories, instead of being locked up in concrete boxes waiting to be experimented on, or to be sent out to kill someone. Because Laura promised me that you would help keep us safe, and you've been honoring that promise ever since. Natasha carefully schooled her features as she moved her hand away from her pistol and back into view, taking a moment to wonder if the other woman would still be thankful to have her around if she knew of all the innocent people just like her and her children the Black Widow had killed in the past. He might have been a monster himself, but Loki had been telling the truth when he said that her ledger wasn't just dripping, it was gushing with red. You're welcome, Natasha replied, the rest of her dark thoughts left unsaid. I just wish I knew why your daughter honored me with her trust in the first place. Don't we both? Sarah agreed, letting out a short exasperated laugh. But I'm glad she did. I think that being here has been good for us, all of us. You don't seem like you get a lot of downtime in your line of work, and even though this is just another one of your missions, you do seem a bit less tense, I guess, whenever you get to spend a few days with us here. It took a moment for Natasha to think about what she had just heard before realizing that she was right. Natasha did feel better after spending some time with this unusual family, in spite of how much of that time was spent training 4 preteen mutant assassins. All of whom were sometimes painfully honest with her, as they may have been trained to fight, and to kill, but they had never been taught how to lie. Seeing little Gabrielle trying to get away with stealing some of the still cooling cookies that their mother had baked for them during her last visit had been hilarious. I will admit that this particular mission hasn't been much of a burden, Natasha finally acknowledged, tilting her head a bit to the side and raising an eyebrow. Though I think we would both sleep a bit easier at night if we knew more about what your other wayward daughter was up to. Yeah, I can't argue that, Sarah sighed, shaking her head. At least she does still send the occasional email, letting me know how things are going for her, wherever she is. I actually just got another one from her just before I came here to talk, and she told me she doesn't blame me for anything the others did to her, and that they're all lucky to have me as a mother. I can't. Natasha watched as the arms that Sarah had wrapped across her stomach tightened in the hug the woman wished she could be giving to her absent child. But, she says her studies are still going well, Sarah continued, reaching up to wipe away an unshed tear with a small sniff. They apparently handed her a stack of school books to study, basic junior high-level math and science, since they never taught her that stuff back at the facility. Interesting that they're only getting to that now, Natasha noted, filing that fact away for later. Makes me wonder what they've been teaching her for the last 3 months that didn't require it before. Whatever it is, there sure seems to be a lot of it, Sarah nodded, before dropping her arms to her sides and squaring her shoulders. She did ask me to do something for her, though. Oh? Natasha asked, the curious tilt to her head returning. And what was that? To give you a hug, Sarah admitted, nervously shifting her weight from one foot to the other. If that's okay with you, that is. I don't want to assume. No, it's fine, Natasha agreed, feeling a bit awkward as she allowed Sarah to step forward and wrap her arms around her waist, before wrapping her own arms around shorter woman's shoulders. It's fine. Sarah started to tremble in her arms after a few moments, at first causing Natasha to think that she was nervous, before noticing the front of her shirt starting to become damp. It took her a few seconds to recognize the fact that the shorter woman was silently crying, the occasional faint sob more felt than heard as she sought comfort in the arms of a world-class assassin. It's fine, Natasha repeated, reaching one hand up to rest it on the back of Sarah's head as she felt the other woman's arms tighten around her waist. Natasha stood there holding the crying woman in her arms as all of the unshed tears that had built up over the last several years seemed to fight for release all at once, the forgiveness of her first child being the final impact needed to break down the wall that had been holding them back. And yet, Sarah barely let out a single sound, making Natasha realize that even now the distraught mother was trying to keep the rest of her children from worrying about her. The rather intimate moment was interrupted by a loud thump, followed by an unintelligible shout and the unmistakable sound of children chasing after each other down in the floor below them. Sarah pulled back from Natasha with a wet chuckle, looking much better than she had earlier, in spite of her blotchy cheeks and red eyes. I'd better go take care of that, before they bring the house down around our ears, Sarah joked, taking a moment to wipe her damp cheeks off with a shirt sleeve, before looking down to see the slightly darker wet patch she had left on Natasha's black field suit. Oh, sorry. Don't worry about it, Natasha said, waving off her concern. I'll finish getting unpacked while you handle whatever is going on downstairs. Okay, Sarah readily agreed, sniffing in an attempt to clear her nose. Thank you for the hug. Natasha watched as Sarah made her way down the stairs and out of sight, her lips quirking into a grin as she listened to the children stop bickering with each other and gather around their surprised mother when they obviously caught the scent of her freshly shed tears, putting their momentary differences aside to help comfort her. Shaking her head, Natasha closed her bedroom door and walked back over to finish unpacking her duffel bag, allowing herself to wonder what it would have been like if she had someone like Sarah in her own life when she finally escaped the clutches of the Red Room. She had just picked up the last of her spare tactical uniforms when she came across the Stark tablet that had been safely nestled in the middle of the bag, revealing the flashing notification that she had received a priority message. Setting the uniform to the side, she picked the tablet up and unlocked the screen, quickly opening up her messages to reveal that she had received another email reply from Laura Kinney. She quickly scanned the email with her eyes, checking if there was anything urgent for her to deal with, before slowly reading it again in order to analyze what was, and sometimes more importantly wasn't, being said. She had to wonder if Laura had lied when she said she hadn't heard about the number of bombings that had happened, since the major news networks had hardly stopped talking about the Mandarin since he had claimed responsibility nearly 2 months ago. On the other hand, if she was telling the truth, that implied she was being trained in a fairly remote location. An important detail, but unfortunately that didn't really help narrow down where she actually was, beyond their current estimate being somewhere in South Asia. It was interesting that Laura felt it necessary to mention the fact that she was going to be learning basic math and science, as a stepping stone to higher science. This was the first time that she actually gave any concrete detail on what she was learning beyond having difficulty, making headway, or having a breakthrough, which could be frustratingly vague. On the other hand, that reminded her about her promise to get some educational materials for Belladonna, since she had mentioned wanting to learn more about how the chemical sensors that Stark had designed actually worked. Come to think of it, all of the girls could use a bit of basic education, since they all had the exact same level of knowledge before being brought here to the cabin. She made a mental note to ask Clint for some advice the next time she saw him, since he should have a good idea of what the Kinney girls would need, since him and his wife homeschooled their own 2 children. Turning her attention back to the email, she begrudgingly accepted that Laura had a good point about not wanting to travel while things were being blown up on a distressingly regular basis. Not that Natasha figured that a few measly explosions could keep the mutant assassin from getting anywhere she wanted to get to, having watched what little footage they did have of Laura successfully infiltrating a string of airports during her stealthy trip to India. She had some impressive stealth skills, the same as her sisters, though of course none of them were anywhere close to Natasha's level. Having Laura thank her for getting the chemical sensors set up reminded her of how exhausted Stark had looked when she had gone to ask him for his help. She couldn't help but be reminded of how he had looked while slowly dying of palladium poisoning, and she made another mental note to keep a closer eye on her fellow Avenger. Reaching the end of the email, she slowed down as Laura once more thanked her for keeping her family safe, and for being there for them during her absence. That made Natasha wonder again just how much Laura really knew about her own past, and what limits that knowledge had, if she was willing to place the safety of her family into a pair of hands that were covered in the blood of the innocent. There might be a link between the knowledge Laura seemed to have about Natasha's past, and the training she was supposedly undergoing in order to remove the mental programming that had been done to herself and her sisters. She would have to keep an eye out for any other clues to support the idea, since she was limited to the amount of information she could gain from the girl without being able to interact with her face to face. Not seeing any reason to immediately reply to the email, Natasha locked the screen on her tablet and set it aside. Deciding she had given Sarah long enough to calm her children down, she gathered up the small pile of dirty clothing that had built up during her most recent mission and made her way downstairs. The laundry wouldn't clean itself, after all. If you like this content, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you later, bye bye.